Chapter 1. Cultural and Historical Beginnings. The InLonSchka dance and traditions came to the Osages from the Poncas and the Kaw, or Kansa, tribes in the mid-1880s after the Osage tribe had made its final move to Indian Territory from Kansas. At that time, the Osages turned away from their old ceremonies and turned instead to the InLonSchka. The tribe settled in 3 locations that are now Gray Horse, Pawhuska, and Hominy in Oklahoma. The band of Osages at Gray Horse, the dwellers upon the hilltop, received the InLonSchka dances, traditions, and drums from the Poncas. The band of Osages at Pawhuska, the dwellers in the thorny thicket, and at Hominy, the dwellers in the upland forest, received the InLonSchka dance, traditions, and drums from the Kaws. These 3 communities remain the center for tribal activities today and are the locations for the annual InLonSchka dances. As the Osages left Kansas for Indian Territory, they were a driven, confused, and divided people, divided by many moves and broken treaties and by interaction and intermarriage with the whites. Adding to their confusion after they moved into Indian Territory were pressures to allot their reservation and assimilate with other Indian tribes as well as whites. The following brief description of Osage history during these troubled times serves as a backdrop against which the InLonSchka emerged as the Osage's most important ceremonial dance, celebrating the tribe's survival from the unrecorded past into the late 20th century. It helped them through a time of great stress and spiritual confusion then, and it continues to serve as a cultural and spiritual reinforcement in the 1980s. In 1803, the U.S. government, through the Louisiana Purchase, assumed jurisdiction and control over the country inhabited by the Osages. President Thomas Jefferson thought the new territory might serve as a new home for Eastern Indians, whose land was coveted by his nation's citizenry. Apparently, little thought was given to the tribes, such as the Osages, who already occupied the vast Louisiana territory and would violently protest these intrusions. Footnote 1. That's from John Joseph Matthews, The Osages, Children of the Middle Waters, page 349, from David Baird, The Osage People, Centennial Issue, 1872 to 1972, page 28 and 29. And there's an image here, map 1. It shows lands ceded by the Great and Little Osages in treaties 1808 through 1870, adapted from David Baird, The Osage People, page 31. And you can see that in 1880 we lost Missouri. We lost a bunch of our territory in Missouri, and then in 1818 we lost some of our southern territory in what is now Oklahoma and Arkansas. In 1825 we lost a ton of territory in Oklahoma and Kansas, except for some strips in Kansas, which were then lost in 1865 and 1870. All right, back to the text. The history of the Osage tribe following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was marked by a series of treaties with the United States in 1808, 1818, 1825, 1865, and 1870. See map 1. In which the Osage lands were progressively reduced and the tribe forced westward. The political importance and strength held by the tribe before those treaties eroded them was never regained. Although the Osages had been noted as great warriors in wars with other tribes and against settlers and trappers, they fortunately avoided a major war with the United States, probably because constant war with both the eastern immigrant tribes and the plains tribes weakened the Osages' capacity to resist the advance of the white frontier. Footnote 2. That's from John Joseph Matthews, Osages, page 349. End footnote. By 1872, the Osages had settled on rich lands in southeastern Kansas, but in that year, the United States paid the tribe $10 million to move a final time to Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory. The new reserve was purchased from the Cherokees for 70 cents an acre, with the proceeds of the Osages' Kansas lands, leaving some $8.5 million in the Osage Tribal Trust. And there's an image on this page. Figure 1, white hair, Pawhuska, head chief of the Great Osages, who signed the 1808 treaty and died shortly thereafter. Adapted by Chris Musgrave from a crayon drawing by St. Memon in 1804 upon Whitehair's visit to Washington, D.C. And it's a profile picture of a strong-looking Indian with black dark hair tied back, but wearing, it looks like a French coat. Back to the text. The reservation extended from what is now Bartlesville to Ponca City, and from the Kansas border to Tulsa. It later formed the largest county in Oklahoma, some 1,370,000 acres, but a small fraction of the tribe's once vast holdings. The Osages chose to move near the center of their new reserve and establish their capital at Pawhuska, named after a later chief, Pawhuska, who had led them to his final reservation. Footnote 3, and narrator's comment, hair in the Osage language is Pahu, and the color white is Ska. So we call the city Pawhuska, but we would pronounce the phrase white hair as Pawhuska. So, I don't know, I think I kind of switched between those two pronunciations when talking about the chief's name. Sorry about that. So, to footnote 3, that's also from John Joseph Matthews' interview from August 1974. End footnote. In 1872, there was no way of anticipating two developments regarding the Osage land and Indian Territory. First, new cattle breeds with more tender meat came to dominate the cattle industry. These breeds grazed better on Osage bluestem than on any other natural ground cover, making the western portion of the Osage Reserve valuable as grazing range. Second, pocketed in the thick bed of limestone that underlay Osage land was something a lot more valuable than grass or cattle: enormous deposits of oil and natural gas. The discovery of the big oil pools under the Osage Reserve led to dramatic changes in the tribe. The Osages changed from a people of hunters and warriors and a life of mobility to the settled life of landowners. It was the first time the government had been a part of a displacement in which the Indians would profit more from their new lands than they had from their old. Footnote 4. Also from John Joseph Matthews, and also Jonathan Quinty, the Mullendore murder case, page 20. It's the source for that. And footnote, and then there's a couple of pictures. Figure 2 on the previous page is a picture of the Osage Agency at Pawhuska. I think this is the building on the top of the hill. I'm not totally sure, though. If you've been to Pawhuska, you know what I'm talking about. And then figure 3 is a picture of a horse grazing with some oil rigs and power lines in the photo. And it says, "A view of the Osage wealth, stock and oil. This scene is near Burbank, Oklahoma, where the large oil fields were discovered. The bluestem grass that grows on the rocky land makes good grazing for cattle and horses." Back to the text. Convinced of the need to create a new form of tribal government after coming to Indian Territory, the Osage tribe met in a Grand Council in January 1881. A member of this Grand Council was James Bigheart, a full-blood chief of the Big Beaver Band and an able and active Osage leader and politician from the 1880s until his death in 1906, a crucial period in tribal relocation and reorganization. He was one of several full-blood leaders who helped to steer the Osage tribe through the difficult times of severalty. Understanding the vulnerability of the individual Osage to manipulation and swindle, he set about to prevent this by helping to organize the tribe into a unit. As the Osage Nation, rather than as individual Osages, the tribe had a better chance of getting results in hearings from the U.S. government. Footnote 5. This is from Terry P. Wilson, The Underground Reservation, Osage Oil, page 30 and 32, and from Orpha Russell, Chief James Bigheart of the Osages, Chronicles of Oklahoma, volume 32. Number 4, page 388 to 389. Considered the prime mover in organizing the Osage Grand Council and guiding its deliberations, Bigheart was rewarded for his efforts in the tribe's behalf by being elected president of the National Council. In 1881, this same Osage Grand Council appointed a committee from within the council to draft a working document for a new form of government and an Osage constitution. 2 Osage political parties also emerged in 1881. The Full-Bloods and the Mixed Bloods. These parties still exist in the 1980s. Footnote 6. That's from Fitzpatrick, Treaties and Laws of the Osage Nation as Passed, November 26, 1890, page 51 to 55. And I'll say I'm reading this in 2026, and there's only one full-blood Osage left, and I think that's Mongrain Lookout. So the vast, all of us are mixed bloods now, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And tribal enrollment follows familial descent, not blood quantum these days. Back to the text. The Osage Constitution that was finally presented to the council was modeled after the Cherokee Constitution, which in turn had been modeled after that of the United States. It provided for the organization of the Osage Nation with a legislative council known as the National Council, an executive branch headed by a principal chief and an assistant chief, both to be elected every 2 years by the popular vote of every Osage male over 21. A judicial branch composed of a Supreme Court with justices to be elected, not appointed, for 2-year terms, and a sheriff elected from each district of the tribe to help in providing criminal justice. The general tone of this constitution proved that the Osages were trying to provide a realistic, workable form of government for the tribe as well as asserting themselves as a sovereign nation. Footnote 7, that's from the same source as before. 15 chiefs and prominent men signed their names to the new constitution. Because of the support of this impressive group of Osage leaders, tribal respect for the new government grew. In the first election held in February 1882, Governor Joe was elected as principal chief and Strike Axe as the assistant chief, and James Bigheart, Saucy Chief, Ne Kahepona, and Claremore were among the 15 chosen as legislators. Footnote 8. This is from Russell, Chief James Bigheart of the Osage, page 389. Narrator's note, this original tribal council also included my ancestor, Jules Trumbley, who was a mixed blood at that time. Back to the text. The year 1882 was of special importance to the Osage in quite a different way from the new tribal political organization. As partial payment for their ceded Kansas lands, the Osages were given cattle from the government. This was a small token towards the government's promise to teach the Osages to farm. From 3 to 5 head of cattle were delivered to each family. At that time, all of the land still belonged to the tribe, and an Osage could use all that he fenced. Although some Osages recognized the possibility of grazing and fattening the cattle on the blue stem grass and began ranching, most of the Osages opposed farming and ranching, but supported the tribal leasing of these valuable grasslands to Texas and Kansas rangers and farmers. Agent Laban Miles encouraged the Osages in this leasing of their natural pasturage, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs reluctantly agreed to this proposal after limiting the grange to the northern reaches of the Osage Preserve. In December 1882, the National Council agreed to the first grazing leases. That's footnote 9. That comes from, same as before, Chief James Big Heart of the Osage. End footnote. In December 1895, Osage Indian agent H.B. Freeman, with the knowledge and support of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, approved a 10-year lease to Henry Foster of Independence, Kansas, for the, quote, exclusive privilege of testing for and producing oil and natural gas on the Osage Reservation, end quote. This proposal was presented to the Osage National Council in March 1896, and by a narrow vote of 7-6 was approved. Signed by James Big Heart and Saucy Chief, the lease was then forwarded to the Department of the Interior, where it received final approval and drilling of the first oil well began. Footnote 10, that's from Wilson, Underground Reservation, page 100. It was Big Heart's hope that finding oil and gas would prove to the tribe the advisability of holding their lands in common rather than giving in to the allotment of the reservation to each Osage individually, as the government had succeeded in doing with the other tribes in 1896. By 1906, he had proved conclusive that there were large oil deposits under the Osage Reserve. The Indian policy of the U.S. government in 1887, through the Dawes and Curtis Act of Congress, was to allot to each Indian 160 acres of his tribal reservation. The surplus portion of these reservations were then open to white settlement. The full-blood party, led by Big Heart and Black Dog, fought the allotment bills with all of their powers. They argued that the Osages were not ready for allotment of their lands, did not want it, and would not be able to agree on the division of land if allotment was forced on them. The full-blood leaders brought up old grievances as well, claiming that the Osages had not been paid enough for their Kansas lands, and that names had been placed on the tribal roll illegally. In fact, their main issue was that there were non-Osages on the roll, and those names would have to be deleted before allotment could be accepted. Footnote 11, that's from Matthews, Osages, page 772, Baird, The Osage People, page 67 and 68, Garrick Allen Bailey, Changes in Osage Social Organization, 1673 to 1906, page 89, end footnote. Big Heart also noted that, like the other tribes of Indians who had experienced government allotment, the Osages might very well lose their allotments after the reservation had been broken up. Big Heart is credited with having held up the Osage allotment for over 10 years, and as a result, the Osages were exempt from the Dawes and Curtis Act. Understanding the Osage struggle to hold on to their lands, Agent Laban Miles wrote in 1890 that the Osages considered their reserve in Indian Territory as especially their own because they had bought it from the Cherokees and had paid for it and had been promised through treaty with the United States that it would remain their permanent home. He concluded that, quote, the Osages deem themselves a nation with a big N, end quote. Footnote 12. That's from Bard, Osage People, page 68, Wilson, Underground Reservation, page 34. End footnote. However, by 1902, support for the Osage allotment had grown among both the full-bloods and the mixed-bloods. The entire tribe had profited by avoiding severalty as long as possible, but as Oklahoma statehood grew closer to reality, the time had come for Osage allotment. But an allotment with a difference. The final form of the Osage Allotment Act demonstrated the political wisdom of both the Osage full-blood faction and the mixed-bloods. In June of 1906, an allotment bill drafted by the tribe was approved by Congress. it differed from other Indian allotment acts primarily by reserving all mineral rights for the tribe as a whole. That is, the mineral rights under the top 15 inches of soil. And by dividing the surplus lands among the members of the Osage tribe, thus preventing any wild settlement runs like that of the Cherokee Strip, or the loss of any Osage land to white settlers. This separation of surface and mineral rights allowed the Osages to become the wealthiest tribe in the nation. Footnote 13. That's from Bard, Osage People, and Wilson, the Underground Reservation. The great coup of the Osage leaders in delaying allotment until they were able to save the land and its mineral rights for their people allowed the Osages to maintain the InLonSchka through their economic independence, while other less fortunate Indian tribes had to give up their individual ceremonies. From the very first, the proper enrollment of tribal members was a problem, but it became even more difficult as the wealth of the Osages increased, making citizenship in the Osage Nation a matter of great importance. A federal investigation of the Osage Indian rolls was begun in 1896 to remove those not entitled to Osage property rights. Records kept by the Catholic and Protestant churches during the 19th century became especially valuable in giving proof of parentage and Osage lineage. Proper enrollment, however, continued to be a problem through the final check of the Osage roll provided by the Osage Allotment Act in 1906. This roll was closed on July 1906 with the provision that any child born to an enrolled Osage by July 1907 could also be enrolled. After July 1907, the allotment was permanent, and those remaining on the Osage roll at this date were known as original allottees. Just a narrator's note here. This is my ancestor, Jules Trumbley, was one of these original allottees as a member of tribal council. Back to the text. No child born after that time would go upon the rolls or receive anything except by inheritance of the tribal wealth. Footnote 14. The Osage rolls are the official tribal listing of members of the Osage tribe. Many non-Osages had also gone on the Osage rolls during the tribal moves. In 1896, proof of Osage ancestry had to be established before a name was entered in the official Osage rolls at the Osage Agency in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. That's from Muriel Wright, A Guide to the Indian Tribes of Oklahoma, page 191, and Wilson, Underground Reservation, page 90. The surface land was allotted individually, while the minerals were allotted collectively to the 2,229 legitimate Osages on the official rolls as of July 1, 1907. Each member received a tract of 160 acres, designated as the homestead and restricted against sale for 25 years, and 498 acres of surplus land, for a total of 658 acres for each member of the tribe. Tribal funds were divided, and the pro rata share of each tribal member, $3,819, was credited to his or her account in the U.S. Treasury. The interest and royalties from the exploitation of minerals were distributed per capita to the members of the tribe quarterly after agency operating expenses were set aside. Footnote 15. That's from Matthews, and so are the next several footnotes, so I'm just going to skip those. In the Osage Allotment Act was a provision for the Osage Reservation in the event of statehood. These lands became Osage County, with Pawhuska as the county seat, as Oklahoma gained statehood in November 1907. Certain tracts were saved in Hominy, Greyhorse, and Pawhuska for communal property for those Osages wishing to continue the traditional village life. With these 360-acre tracts, the Osages provided for some continuation of the old traditional group living. The tracts continue to remain in the 1980s as places for any Osage to stay without cost for as long as he or she desires. These areas are referred to in each of the towns as the Indian Village. And it is these Indian villages in Pawhuska, Hominy, and Greyhorse which serve as the settings for the annual InLonSchkas. The Osage Allotment Act established an Osage Council, composed of an elected principal chief, an assistant chief, and 8 councilmen to be elected biannually. The council was also authorized to execute mineral leases, subject to the approval of the Secretary of the Interior. The former Osage National Council, which had been established in 1881 with 3 members from each of the 5 Osage districts, was abolished. The Osage Council, established under the Allotment Act, was amended in 1929 so that the officers of the council were elected quadrennially rather than biannually by an electorate composed of tribal members 21 years of age or over whose names appeared on the last quarterly annuity roll. In other words, only those tribal members with the head rights or fractional head rights are allowed to vote in the tribal elections if they are over 21. The Osage Council operates under neither a constitution nor a corporate charter. Instead, it functions like a board of directors of a corporation, exercising authority in leasing the tribal estate, in determining the bonus value of any tract offered for lease, and in the use of tribal funds, and in the administration of the tribal reserves located at Greyhorse, Hominy, and Pawhuska. The bill also provided that the Osages could sell the surplus lands if they were able to satisfy the Secretary of the Interior that they were capable of managing their own affairs. Upon proof, usually simply the ability to read and write, of their capability to manage their own affairs, the Osages were issued their certificates of competency from the government. Also, each Osage, upon receiving his certificate of competency, could withdraw his trust fund, which had been kept by the government. Therefore, these documents became very important and were necessary before an Osage could control his or her property. And we have a new footnote. This is from Barney, Laws Relating to the Osage Tribe. End footnote. Although the U.S. government had tried to protect the Osage Indians from unscrupulous whites, loopholes in the laws or ways around the laws were found by many whites who wished to take advantage of the Osage wealth. Some adult Osages were declared incompetent. Young Osages often became wards of the local courts. Wealthy Osages were murdered, wills turned up leaving Osage estates to local politicians instead of the Osages' families. Although the Osages were not allowed by law to sell their head rights, they could will them. However, if a non-Osage inherited such a head right, he could sell it. An active market developed for the Osage head rights in the 1920s for as much as $100,000 per head right. And this comes from James Ballard, The World of the American Indian, in something called Mullendore. Oh, that's The Murders of Mullendore, yeah. And also the previous one, which was Laws Relating to Osage Tribe. Back to the text. In 1917, the Board of Indian Commissioners sent George Vaux Jr. to visit the Osage Tribe. He described their problems as entirely different from those of other Indian tribes he had visited. Quote, "With the Osages, the problem is the problem of riches," end quote, he declared. He was particularly disturbed that there had been no training offered to the full-bloods on the handling of large sums of money. Footnote, that's from Underground Reservation, page 127 and 128. End footnote. The Osages were especially vulnerable, with some families receiving $65,000 a year in the bonanza. Many did not know what to do with their money, buying unnecessary items alien to their world, such as grand pianos, porcelain, silver flatware, and large houses. Merchandise was often sold at tremendous markups to them, and often Osages were tricked into enormous debts. It was at this time that the government decided that the Osages needed guardians unless they could prove their competency. Footnote 21. That's Barney, Laws Relating to the Osage Tribe, page 62. Everyone wanted to be a guardian, and guardianship became another way of bilking the Osage wealth. John Collier wrote, quote, "In Oklahoma, individualized Indian estates were looted through a system of local white guardians, named by the Oklahoma courts pursuant to congressional grants of power. To over 2,000 Osages, with no experience in money economy and battened upon by the white population in the 16 years following 1915, there was paid out in cash by the government $2,265,000,000 in royalties from the Osage oil. 90% went downwind of ruined Osages and corrupted and corrupting whites." End quote. That's from John Collier, The Indians of the Americas. Narrator's note here, $265 million in 1915 would be $8.6 trillion today. So that's a lot of money. Back to the text. The murder of wealthy Osages was also a part of the effort of unscrupulous whites to gain the Osage wealth. The, quote, "Osage Reign of Terror," end quote, is how Matthews and the newspapers of the time referred to that period in the 1920s, when there were epidemics of Osage murders. This was the, quote, "most uncivilized, savage period in Oklahoma history, with the savages being the whites," end quote. Footnote 23, that comes from a Matthews interview from August 1974. End footnote. Because of their economic wealth and security, many members of the Osage tribe have become integrated into society, as they have received educations enabling them to enter professional fields. In the 1970s, there were about 300 full-blooded, one half living in Osage County and the other one half scattered. The predominant majority of the tribe in the 1970s and 1980s were the mixed bloods. At the crucial time of the Osages' removal to Indian Territory, they turned away from their old ceremonies, which were no longer serving them as well as they had in Kansas and Missouri. They turned instead to two new ceremonies, which came from other tribes in the late 19th century. The dance the Osages named the InLonSchka, and the peyote religion. These two ceremonies helped them in coping with their new life in both the white man's world and the Indian world, both through a time of great stress and spiritual confusion. Footnote 24. That's from Kate Lester Jones, Osage Indians from Oklahoma Today, volume 36, number 3, page 32 and 33. Both the peyote religion and the InLonSchka have served as cultural reinforcement through the 20th century. The peyote religion came to the Oklahoma Indians from the Mescalero Apaches in the 1870s and was formally incorporated as the Native American Church in Oklahoma in October 1918. Although interest in this religion among the Osages was strong throughout most of the 20th century, by the 1980s, interest in the Native American Church declined among the Osages, with only some 5 fireplaces still in use. Footnote 25. That's from Renard Strickland, The Indians in Oklahoma, page 70 and 71. On the other hand, the InLonSchka continues to flourish and remains as a great source of inspiration and strength to the tribe. Over 300 dancers are present in the dance arenas of Gray Horse, Hominy, and Pawhuska. On each of the 3 weekends, the dances are held in June. Osages, both old and young, full blood and mixed blood, join in the dance. It is the sense of the tribes having survived and succeeded which guides the practice of the Osage ceremony. The InLonSchka today becomes a celebration of the reflourishing of the tribe.